Ukraine appears ready to launch its long-awaited counteroffensive. Preparations are coming to an end, according to the government, and expectations are high, not only in Ukraine, but also amongst its allies. Drone strikes on targets in Russian-occupied parts of Crimea are laying the ground for Ukraine's move, since these areas are crucial for Russian resupply. At the same time, Russia is building trench networks so massive they're visible from outer space and launching nightly air attacks on Kiev and other cities. Ukraine's defense minister says his land is defending not only itself, but Europe, and has earned a full membership in NATO. Today, we're asking Ukraine's counteroffensive, can it meet expectations? Hello and welcome to The Point. It is a pleasure to welcome our guests, beginning with Christoph Reuter, who reports from conflict zones, including Ukraine, for the German news magazine Der Spiegel. Yuliya Bidenko is associate professor at Kharkiv University in Kharkiv, and she's also a research fellow at the Berlin-based Center for East European and International Studies, ZOIS. And Nick Connolly reports from Ukraine for DW, and he joins us today from Kiev. Great to see you again, Nick. And let me start with you and ask you what signs you are seeing there on the ground that, in fact, this long-awaited counteroffensive is now pending.
Well, we are finally seeing lots of those things on Ukraine's wish list in terms of Western weapons finally arriving, air defense systems, those tanks that were just, on everyone's minds for months and seemingly no progress coming. That finally is materializing. As for actual kind of actions on the ground, we've seen a bit of an attempt by the Ukrainians to attack Russian positions on the other side of the Dnieper River from Kherson, but very little in the way of a full-scale attack. I think the expectations just are mounting, and everyone feels like the Ukrainian government now is under huge pressure to deliver some results.
These explosions in occupied Crimea, what's behind that?
I think this is about disrupting Russia's logistics. It's about depriving them of fuel, of the ability to bring in supplies to their garrisons. They had kind of thought that occupied Crimea was their kind of safe hinterland, and I think the Ukrainians are proving time and time again that it isn't.
Christoph, what's your impression of morale on the Ukrainian side as this counteroffensive is impending?
Well, we had the experience in the epicenter of the battle zone in Bakhmut that we underestimate the exhaust, how outworn Ukrainian soldiers have been in this fighting, which is much more brutal than just using artillery. What we have not seen there, or what we don't know, is the amount of proper planning to have units. They will not be deployed in any offensive because they are simply too exhausted, but to build up fresh units, other units who will participate in this. So we were basically in a different theater.
And I want to come back to that question of the strength of Ukrainian forces, but there are reports that, in fact, Ukraine has had a massive recruitment drive to bring in new soldiers and, in fact, to give them really in-depth training. Can you confirm that?
Yeah, this has happened. And the other side of the medal is that those units, often the former territorial defense groups that were then incorporated into the army, which were based in Bakhmut, in the Donbass, in the southeastern zones of hell, that they felt a bit abandoned or neglected, that they bore the brunt of the fighting and were not rotating with units which were used specifically, or trained specifically, to be used in an upcoming offensive.
Mm-hmm. Yuliya, let me ask you about reports that there were explosions over the Kremlin. Russia is saying that they were launched by Ukraine in connection with this impending counteroffensive. Does it seem plausible that Kiev actually would seek to attack Russia on its own soil?
Well, for me, it's very questionable because actually Russian propaganda is very diverse. They don't need any justification for more intensive attack on Ukraine. So they definitely don't need this. But Ukrainian army tries to terrify civil population in Russia and to influence probably some protests or some, public moods there. So I can't exclude that Ukraine can be the part of this operation, but I would say that for me, more efficient that is happening with logistic chains in Russia, what happened in Crimea or in other part of Russia than in Moscow, actually, because it's more like a psychological effect.
Thank you very much. Let's take a closer look now. After months of preparation, including recruitment, resupply, and training, how well positioned are Ukraine's forces to make significant gains? We looked here at the state of preparations for this long-awaited spring offensive.
This is Sevastopol in Russian-annexed Crimea, where a fuel depot was allegedly struck by a Ukrainian drone. According to Kyiv, the oil tanks were being used by Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Apparently, acts of sabotage on Russian supply chains are on the rise. At the same time, Ukrainian soldiers are training for an offensive. Most of their tanks seen here are from the 1970s. Their dream machine is the American Abrams. The Abrams is like comparing a brand new Mercedes S-Class to an old Lada. Ukrainian military intelligence is still weighing a possible recapture of Russian-occupied territories this year. But Ukraine still faces massive Russian airstrikes meant to torpedo Ukrainian attack plans. In Uman, a missile has struck an apartment building, killing more than 20 civilians. In Pavlograd, Russian cruise missiles have caused severe damage, killing at least 2 people. Sabotage, drone, and missile attacks, are these the beginning of the offensive?
Nick, let me pass that question on to you, and let me also get you to comment on the degree to which the Ukrainian troops are now supplied with the kind of weapon systems that they need to go ahead. You said the tanks are finally there. We heard the soldiers in that report comparing their dream tank, the U.S. Abrams, to what they referred to as their old Soviet tanks that were like Ladas. Do they, in fact, have the kind of modern weaponry they're going to need?
Well, as far as we understand now, the Abrams are still on their way. It's the German-built Leopard tanks and some of the British Challengers that are already here. And then there's obviously the huge question of the munitions to go with them. There's been a consistent problem through this war that Western military planners just seemingly don't understand quite how intensive this war is, that they don't kind of get into their heads that this is a war being fought over 1,000 kilometers plus. And when you get announcements from kind of Western governments offering to send 2,000, 3,000 shells a month, when this is the kind of quantity that gets fired in a day or even less sometimes, that does leave people scratching their heads here in Kyiv. As for the kind of, is it enough? Well, we've heard some top figures here in Kyiv saying that they think more or less they have what they need, but also we don't know what it is exactly they're planning, how big they're planning to go, and what they're going to face on the other side. But there is a sense that after months of dragging their feet, of kind of endless political wrangling and conflict about Western governments refusing Ukraine's demands, that finally a bit of kind of dynamism is now picking up, and that these deliveries are happening in a more structured and more logical rhythm, and that also the spare parts are being delivered so that when these Western high-tech weapons are exhausted after 2, 3, 4 weeks of intense use, that they can then be quickly repaired and sent back to the front lines.
And Nick, just a very quick follow-up, because I know that you have been talking to soldiers on the front lines who say they can fight even with old weapons and materiel. Is that, in fact, the case, do you think, or are they perhaps kidding themselves?
I think it really depends what they're trying to do, but certainly they've been doing a very good job of getting the best out of often weapons that are twice their age. I think it's also the case that they don't really have a choice, right? They are getting basically material also from Eastern Europe, from countries that still produce this Soviet-era weaponry, and they don't have the choice of saying, well, I'd prefer to wait for the Western stuff to arrive. It's just not going to happen. And I think all this war has just been about improvisation, about dealing with that relative discrepancy between what they have and what the Russians have, and trying to find the Russians' weak points.
Christoph, earlier this year, Germany made headlines by finally committing to deliver those Leopard 2 tanks that Nick referred to. It also tried to put together a tank coalition that included promises from the U.S. to deliver Abrams, but also promises from other Europeans who then dragged their feet. Where does that stand now? What is the situation with regard to these much-discussed deliveries of tanks?
Well, the number will be smaller than initially hoped for. The effect, if you have, 30, 40 or 70 Leopard tanks, this remains to be seen, because as Nick said, the numbers are so small that the impact of modern weaponry can be seen if they're used in a very specific manner for one quick offensive in a specific area, but on an 11-kilometer front line. If you have 100 Leopard, it means one every 100 kilometers. So it's not so much the point if the numbers are this high or this high. Plus, what was made possible is that an older version of the Leopard in higher numbers will be delivered. And for Ukrainian military, they have been able to refurbish T-62, T-64 tanks from the 60s with upgraded material basically from the Home Depot, from electronic stores, so they can deal with it.
Let me ask you about training, because training is obviously key for these new weapon systems that many of the Ukrainian soldiers would not have seen before. Do they have adequate training now as they prepare to go into this new offensive?
What my colleagues hear from the experiences of the German forces, of the trainers, yes, but it's less the question has enough training facility, has enough training been offered, but how do the people pick it up? Germans have experience with training the Afghan army, who was never really interested in new gear, in fighting as much as the Ukrainians. So it's a mutual understanding that training is offered, but also they very, very quickly adapt, get used to it, and are extremely interested in being able to run these machines.
Yuliya, Russia was long thought to have a decisive advantage in terms of the size of its armed forces. At the outset of the war, Kiev talked about amassing a 1 million-strong army. Apparently, a major recruitment drive, as I mentioned earlier, has in fact taken it close to that number. What would you say is the state of morale amongst those Ukrainian forces? Christoph told us many, in fact, at least around Bakhmut, are quite exhausted. What is the state of morale as they move toward this new offensive?
Thank you for asking, because my nephew, he's in the Ukrainian army now, and he's nearby Avdiivka, so it's very dangerous place, and the morale is very high there. And there are a lot of young people, because my nephew is only 19 years old, and there are a lot of young people who joined Ukrainian army and still joining Ukrainian army voluntarily. And I would elaborate here that they are really eager to be trained, and some of them are refusing to get a coffee break, but they want to get knowledge as soon as possible. But really there are a lot of problems with equipment, with ammunition, so it's not only about heavy weaponry, but also to regain, the personal stuff. For example, there is the second helmet which I buy for my own cost, and I know a lot of volunteers from Kharkiv, from Dnipro, and people are collecting and raising money for everyday needs. Among them are vehicles, among them are drones. So really, it's kind of a civil society really involved there. The level of morale is very high, but I would say that when the Western supplies are coming to Ukrainian army, the hostilities are not so, dangerous for Ukrainian soldiers, because they, on the front line, feel themselves more covered and more secure from the back line.
And just briefly, if you would, because there have, of course, been many, many pleas coming from Kiev for the West to deliver more and faster. And obviously some disappointment there. What about among the troops? Do they feel that, in essence, Western allies have left them in the lurch?
I would say they have no choice but to fight back, So it's not about the wish to be involved in this war, but the tactic of Russian army is showing that it is very, cruel war, and actually they're standing for their country, not for Kiev regime, for Zelensky or somebody else. So they protecting their mothers, their families, and they have no another choice.
Christoph, what do we know about Ukraine's aims for the counteroffensive? Nick said not all that much. We don't know how far it's likely to go. We don't know exactly what form it could take. What are you hearing?
Well, I would second what Nick said, because if we see retrospectively the most successful offensive the Ukrainians did, it was a total surprise when everybody was expecting the offensive in the south, and instead they liberated all the area around Kharkiv in the Far East. So even if we would get any hints where it will start, which areas it will target, I would think that it is rather an attempt to divert attention than to giving us the real details, because nothing would be more detrimental to any success of this offensive if it would be known, if it would be made public before. So we don't know, and we don't think that they will leak.
And Nick, if I may, a quick look at the Russian side. The head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group says that he definitely does see signs of a looming Ukrainian counteroffensive, and he took the opportunity to complain that his forces have far too little artillery ammunition, and that, in fact, if things continue as they are, that he would have to consider withdrawing them. Artillery was long thought to be a very big problem on both sides. What is the situation now at the moment on that score?
Well, again, the Russians are obviously keeping tight-lipped about what they actually have in their storage units. But I think this is also part of a bigger power struggle between those mercenary groups, Wagner being the most prominent of those, and the regular Russian army. So there's a sense that Prigozhin and his troops are being deprived of ammunition because they were doing too well, they were getting too much attention, and were basically putting the regular Russian army in the shade, especially in terms of all the kind of Kremlin politics. So I'm not sure that actually means that Russia is not able to produce more ammunition. Russia has all the metallurgical facilities, has all the factories, has basically a Soviet-era military industrial complex that is basically set up for exactly this kind of war. What they are struggling with is cruise missiles, anything that involves a bit more technology, because they were basically 100% dependent on Western spare parts, Western ships, and they can't do it on their own.
And I want to turn in just a moment to talk about how Ukrainian citizens are looking toward this counteroffensive. But Christoph, if you would, just one word once again on expectations, because I saw one quote this week from a Western military expert saying that, in his view, the Ukrainian forces are now the best equipped, best prepared, best trained army in the world, at least for the kind of war they're fighting. Would you agree?
Best equipped? No. Because still, for a front line, which in one line would reach from here to Italy, if you have 50 or 100 or 150 Leopard tanks, this is not sufficient. Plus, you have to see that the brunt of the equipment is of the age of when I was younger, from the 70s, 60s, and you have a few modern parts. I think we are, many military officials here are in an illusion about what it means to deliver rather small numbers of high-tech equipment, if it's really deployed in an actual battle, because then it might simply be scrap metal after 1 month. Or the barrels. There was here a lot of irritation about these Panzerhaubitze 2000, that the barrels, after only 1-2 months, needed to be exchanged. Yeah, of course, if they are used for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 shots, every barrel needs to get exchanged. But in this army of simulation in the West, they never used them so much. So they were surprised about real warfare. So no, I would not agree with that.
Can I come in there?
Please. Yep.
I just want to say, I think most Western generals, German, American, British, have never fought a war like this.
Yeah.
They fought against insurgencies in the Middle East, maybe. They've been on peacekeeping missions, but they only know about these kind of wars from memoirs from the Second or maybe even the First World War. So they really are often just not able to grasp the scale of this and the intensity.
Yeah.
What we certainly do also know from those prior conflicts is that it's not only the resilience of the armed forces themselves, but also of the larger population that will influence the outcome both of this counteroffensive and of the war as a whole. Russia's massive attacks throughout the winter on Ukraine's critical infrastructure, on its water, electricity, and housing have deprived many citizens of their homes and their livelihoods. Yet, they don't appear to have daunted most people's will to carry on.
This woman's house is being demolished because the damage caused by Russian shells during the Battle of Irpin was far too great. This hurts a lot. It's like someone ripped out a piece of my heart or soul. And yet many people want to remain in their homeland, including residents of Chasiv Yar, which rests near the embattled city of Bakhmut. There is a field kitchen in the market where the soldiers eat. We get whatever's left over. They're holding out hope that Ukrainian troops will push the Russians back. Ukrainian soldiers enjoy a small diversion with music between combat operations. We treasure our culture now more than ever because we're united in a common goal, which is victory. Maintaining morale, that's what these moments are all about. Where do Ukrainians draw their strength from?
And let me pass that question right on to Yuliya. What's your answer to that? Where do they draw the strength from? What are you hearing from family and friends?
Well, my family is in Kharkiv now, but also I have a lot of friends in Kiev or even in southern Ukraine, and I would say that cohesion, social cohesion and regional cohesion in Ukraine, probably the highest since the gaining independence in 1991. And actually, there are more than 70% of people who declare that they try to make their input in this resistance with donating money, with donating some stuff for internally displaced persons. So there are a lot of people who switch into Ukrainian, not to speak Russian, especially from the eastern part of Ukraine. I have these examples in my family. My mom is ethnical Russian, but she's speaking only Ukrainian now and consider herself to be Ukrainian citizen. So the identity to be Ukrainian citizen and actually even to be a European person is increased significantly. And I would say that more than 60% of Ukrainians consider that Ukraine should resist further even without the Western, assistance, even being abounded by Western allies.
And what are the expectations of Ukraine's citizens in regard to the counteroffensive? Do they expect it to be decisive for the war, or do they have the sense that this war could drag on for quite some time?
Well, there is no consensus about my colleagues in Ukraine, and there are a lot of memes and jokes because Ukrainians have a brilliant sense of humor, and it's also part of the resilience of Ukrainian society. But I would add here that according to the recent public opinion poll conducted by Razumkov Center, 93% of Ukrainians, they believe in Ukrainian victory. And about 50%, so half of people believe that the war could be longer than a year. So people are ready to fight for a longer period.
Nick, 1 in 4 Ukrainians is now impoverished. Many live in rubble, as we could see in that report. What's your impression? How long can people hold out?
Certainly, if you're living close to the front lines, you meet lots of people who have lost everything, who've lost their businesses, lost their homes. But I think actually the kind of surprising reality is that actually you don't see many people in total destitution. Most people have either found a way to Western Europe, so that kind of the refugee status has been a real kind of pressure, kind of a valve that allows the pressure out and allows people who don't know what to do a breather. They can go find somewhere to live and be given some kind of benefits, some money to kind of basically work out what to do next. And then lots of people have moved internally. As in 2014, you have lots of people moving to Kiev from eastern parts of the country, finding new businesses. So there is a sense that the economy is now growing once again, and that people are always going to find some way to keep going, even if they've lost a lot of their quality of life and of their earnings.
Christoph, very briefly, if you would, our title asks whether the counteroffensive can meet expectations. What would be your answer to that? Very short.
It can, if it's surprising and if we don't know what it is.
So the mystery remains. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us, and thank you very much to all of our audience for joining in. See you soon.